Hello, thank you so much for having us both.
I'm
Oh,
so
thank
glad you're
you.
here. I will pass it over to you two.
Wonderful. So I am so honored to be here, everyone, especially with my colleague and friend, Ren. We're going to be talking to you all today about the efforts that 2U is doing as a company in highlighting our LGBTQIA plus employee resource group, 2Q. So first and foremost, Ren, welcome. I'm so honored to be doing this with you. I have one question just to start us off. But can you start by just introducing yourself and telling us a bit more about your journey at 2U?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, Courtney. My name is Ren Da. My pronouns are he and they. I'm a faculty relations manager. I'm the global chair for 2Q, our LGBTQIA employee resource group. And I also moonlight as a stand-up comedian. I'm also a trans man, an activist. I'm an educator in both the corporate and nonprofit space, and I'm a happily retired whitewater raft guide and recreational whitewater athlete. So definitely a little bit different from the higher ed space. I originally started in student engagement. I love working in faculty success now, and then also content creation for our BRN, our Business Resource Network programming. Yeah, that's pretty much me in a nutshell. And I'm super thrilled to be speaking to all of you wonderful people with Courtney today.
And before we get into what 2Q is doing and all the amazing work you're doing with them, I would love to hear a little bit more about why you started joining 2Q, like what led you to make that decision?
That's a great question. I kind of got a bit roped into it, if you will. The previous global chair saw that I was engaging in the chat and showing up to events as I was looking for community in the workspace. And yeah, they kind of asked me if I wanted to get a little bit more involved, and it was kind of a snowball from there. And I just got really, I found a lot of enjoyment out of like project management and then also just kind of event coordination. And really doing the work with the team that we get to. The board at 2Q is amazing. All of those chairs put so much into it, so much into the programming. There's a lot that happens, behind the events, if you will. There's a lot that goes on backstage to bring quality programming and discuss what that looks like. And so I think that that's like kind of my favorite part of it and why I wanted to then get more involved.
Thank you for that. I want to get us to our next point here. Before I do that, I want to talk a bit more about like what the company does. So at 2U, we are an ed tech company. We do have hundreds of university partners globally, bringing online access to education for higher degrees, boot camps, coding, all of the things you can think of. We have a program for it. But I want to hear about your experience with being at 2U, Ren. You mentioned that you were in multiple departments before landing where you are now. And let's look at your career trajectory from day one to where you are right now.
Yes, I started as a humble, we call them AC1s, a humble admissions counselor. And I worked with helping students find continuing education programs and like workforce acceleration programs that would best kind of fit them more over in the tech space. So full stack web development, cybersecurity, UX, UI design, et cetera. And I really enjoyed that work, but the current job I have is probably my favorite job I've ever had. I am a faculty relations manager, so I'm the main point of contact for all questions, concerns, and technical issues and administrative changes related to faculty support for several graduate portfolios. So essentially, I try to fix problems for faculty and sometimes their students if that gets escalated up to our department. And if I can't fix it, then I try to help air traffic control those needing support to who might be able to fix it or provide that support. And I would say that it's really interesting to see kind of the inner workings of 2U that way, to get to work really cross-departmentally with internal and external stakeholders. And I think that most of 2U is structured around those same concepts of support, service, and providing this quality education while not compromising on accessibility. And that's true in both like the content development side of things and then also kind of the technical element of things as well, I think. So yeah. Love my
Yeah,
job.
definitely. I would agree. You and I have had very similar career journeys here, starting in student engagement. But I want to pivot. I want to highlight what the work that 2Q is doing and the mission. So can you just tell us the origin story of 2Q, how you all came about? What are you currently working on, and what is the mission of 2Q?
Yeah, so simply 2Q is focused on bettering the lives of LGBTQ plus employees through the lens of inclusive corporate policy and internal education. So 2Q was formed after the Pulse shooting in 2016, as our employees had to really reckon with the overtness of queerness being disallowed occupation of public space, either through physical violence and more recently, as we've seen, through legislative violence, essentially. And recently, I would say in November, the Club Q shooting forced our focus to shift from this kind of recognition and advocacy to activation and activism in the workplace, which looks like emphasizing policy implementation that prioritizes safety, equity, and also celebration. I'd say some examples of how kind of that mission is now affecting our current programming includes this year we developed an emergency communications protocols for our ERGs and DEI leaders that provided some rules of triage, protocols for community safety, and it generally aided kind of company-wide preparedness for major sociocultural crisis events. We also spent a good amount of time analyzing safe and accurate data management for our groups so we can assess employee satisfaction, retention, and high need areas without compromising employee privacy, which is then also kind of a safety issue, right? And then lastly, the most exciting thing that I feel like we got to do this year was create a guide to coming out in the workplace that covered employee resources, healthcare navigation, communication best practices for both supervisors and supervisees. So there was both kind of employee resources and then also managerial training that went along with that. And I feel like that was kind of like a multi-angled project and really was able to kind of hit on all the points that we try to cover in our mission.
Yeah, for sure. I can genuinely say, personally speaking, the impact you all have had on the business, and especially the care that goes into protecting the employee base. And like you said, there's privacy concerns there, but being able to be a leader that's able to get those things done is super important. So just giving you your flowers here while we're in this room. But I would love to also hear, we're in June, we're in Pride Month, this is a super exciting month. I know that this month is jam-packed with programming, and I just want to hear about some of the events and things that you all are doing right now within the company to help queer employees and allies celebrate Pride.
Yeah, absolutely. And happy Pride, everyone. Yeah, as a global company, right, Pride isn't just in June, right, in our programming. Our regional chairs in Cape Town, South Africa, organized some really incredible programming. I believe it was in February. That included pronoun workshops, video screenings, AMAs, keynote speakers, kind of discussing, the larger relationship of South Africa with LGBTQ representation and protections. I do truly wish that my like co-global chair, Mantis Momabolo Cunningham, was here with me in this conversation. And I also want to make sure to commend their immense labor and leadership for both the Cape Town community and then our larger global network. This year in the US, our Pride theme was Queer is Not a Crime, as a direct response to the current legislative trends attacking LGBTQ communities, especially targeting gender nonconforming individuals. Our programming centered pushing our employee base from allyship into advocacy and from advocacy into kind of that activation into activism, right? Our lineup of events tried to kind of reflect that. It included conversations with legal counsel on LGBTQ rights for hybrid families. We spoke with different executive directors of nonprofit organizations focused on LGBTQ activism nationwide for an activism training series. We have a cross BRN, like a cross ERG panel discussing burnout in our respective communities. We have a virtual drag performance, discussions around third gender communities globally. So it's been a pretty action-packed month. And I would say that since 2U conducts its work in an international ecosystem, we have to also consider the global environment in programming. This not only means kind of the content of our conversations have to be inclusive and intersectional, but also the access, right? The access to the programming. So that looks like hybrid and virtual events, considering time zone availability, aiming to combat proximity bias, by understanding that convenience of program access is a privilege in the workspace and especially in DEI spaces. For example, just having an event during practical working hours of like 9 to 5, right, is a privilege in accessing programming that another region might not have. And that's also an example of geographic bias. And I think that, when we don't consider those things, it sends a really strong message to employees as to where leadership is actually placing its priority. So those are, I'd say that's kind of the lineup of Pride events that we've had globally this year, and also kind of how we're trying to think about it in a global context.
Yeah, it's super important. And I love that you highlighted the work that is being done for our company globally in Cape Town. So we do have an office there, and then here, respectively, in the United States, accessing the employees on both sides of the line there in the middle of the earth. So it's super exciting that we have that reach. And shout out to Mantis and the work that they're doing in Cape Town as well. So thank you for pointing that out. You brought up a great point about the theme of this month's Pride Month being, queer is not a crime. And that leads me to my next question about what do you see as the difference between what we know as activism and also advocacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that there's a bunch of different ways to spin it. I think, advocates and activists are both dedicated to creating positive change in the world, right? An advocate is someone that kind of works on behalf of an individual, group, or organization, and an activist often will then work to spur that broader social or political change. So for me, I generally think advocates support like a necessary change, a benevolent change, and activists disrupt systems to then create that necessary change. As an example of kind of this in the ERG space, and at least what 2Q has done, in moving from an advocacy approach to an activism approach has been with our work around data. Originally, our approach was to just analyze information on behalf of our group to kind of better understand our zeitgeist in the workplace, or the context that queer folks find themselves in. Are we in leadership? Are we satisfied? Are we, being retained, right? Now our aim is to work towards broader changes in data collection, privacy considerations, and data analysis to show that our group deserves both statistical significance, right? We deserve to have the data on our community, and also kind of the assurance of a protection of privacy, to better cultivate a safe workplace for our queer community. An example of this is, pretty simple, right? It's just requesting third-party platforms that our company uses for work management to move away from binary demographic data collection on profiles. That just kind of gives us like a direct impact on, better being able to look at the data, to look at like affected communities. And quite frankly, if we're not asking the question of these people, if it even exists, then it's hard to then advocate for those people. Another example of moving from advocacy to activism is in employee benefits for queer bodies and birthing bodies. While 2U's ERGs have worked really hard to consolidate resources on behalf of our members to make insurance navigation easier, I would also love to call out another ERG and their work in this, the Women's Alliance Network, WAN. They really took the conversation to the next level by bringing in reproductive justice advocates to talk about what ensuring broader healthcare access and medical security looks like for companies in policies, as kind of national policies around birthing bodies have been in flux over the last year. I think that was really taking it from advocacy to activism, right? And lastly, I would say that just kind of my personal experience as a trans man in the workplace really left a deep impression on me, as I experienced a really overt privilege shift in my identity as I settled into my social and medical transition. It just doesn't feel like it's enough anymore to just work on behalf of something in hopes that it gets better. I really feel like we have to spur that broader social change that we know that we need in order to build a more equitable environment, right? And as we move towards a corporatocracy globally, and ruling bodies are more and more reliant on the private sector, it's really imperative that we build this equity into the world of work, as it's then mirrored by the society that work is conducted in.
Wow, Ren, that's so important. Like genuinely really important to hear the impact that ERGs can have specifically for marginalized communities. You brought up our Women's Alliance Network, and by the way, TU has 9 ERGs globally, which is really awesome to have. And a lot of those ERGs do work together to impact the policies that our company has. One super important one that I want to make sure we highlight is that with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, TQ is super important in leading the charge, along with WAN and our other ERGs, to have that conversation around what do our benefits look like to support birthing bodies, no matter what that person looks like. And how do we make sure that our employees are not being negatively impacted by what our government is doing? And so it's super important to have those voices going to our leadership in the company and making those requests and demanding the change. So it's super important to highlight and amplify that as well. You answered my follow-up question, which was, what are some of the specific communities that TU is looking to highlight? I think you touched on them. Globally as a company, we are making sure that we have representation as much as we can in different sectors of our government and our leadership in our company from all levels, and just making sure that work is being continued, as you said, as being that advocate that stands in on behalf of someone. We need to have those advocates in our leadership. So that's super important. But I do want to hear one point about, as an LGBTQIA plus employee, are there any pain points that you've heard from employees around LGBTQ plus issues, whether that's within the scope of corporate America or in the company that we work for in the world, our government? What are some things that you're hearing?
Yeah, simply healthcare navigation, data collection, job stability, upward mobility, and microaggressions. I would say those are kind of the big pain points for most of kind of our members, at least, and then just kind of in the larger community. I think it's fair to say that everyone just wants a fair shot at being recognized for the work that they do and to not be ostracized for showing up in an authentic way. Right. In previous roles at other companies, I've literally had supervisors ask me super invasive questions about my body parts in meetings in front of stakeholders, and my coworkers and peers thought that since I was so different, right, I'm so other, that this type of transgression is acceptable, that can fly. And that just creates personal turmoil for trans and non-binary people. As presenting our authentic selves can then mean we're being forced to deal with unnecessary scrutiny of our personal lives. It's additional emotional and educational labor, and it's having to put mental resources towards being resilient in what should actually be a psychologically safe environment. And I want to talk about that for a second, right? I kind of hate the idea that marginalized people get called resilient all the time. We are, but we shouldn't have to be, telling right. Marginalized people that they're resilient gives allies permission to do nothing, right? Because we can take it, it's no big deal, right? And that mentality disillusions us from the truth that what has made our groups resilient is also truly terrible, right? It's a major pain point for me personally that inequity, discrimination, and violence are looked at as character building for marginalized groups, but travesties for those in higher positions of privileged and assumed normalcy, right? I was talking to a fellow trans person at Boulder Pride the other day, and they said to me, I don't want to be resilient, I just want a promotion. I just want to be promoted. And I think that sentiment just kind of captures about, the essence of most of these pain points that we try to address as an ERG, right? Is being able to kind of support our community, being able to keep them safe, being able to kind of, fight for and forge that kind of forward momentum for upward mobility and job stability. But at the end of the day, kind of looking at the root of why that resiliency has to exist.
Yes, that's such an important point about, I honestly hate the word resilient as a Black woman. I feel like that's I was born resilient, and I just feel like that's frustrating. And I know you and I have had conversations about that as well, where it's very agitating, where you're expected to just kind of take and be offloaded on so many times. And that's not even just within the workspace, that's personal, professional, social, that's everywhere. And that leads me to my last question. I know that right now there are a lot of anti-gay, specifically anti-trans bills being raised around the country, honestly, globally. And I just want to have a conversation about what does that legislative impact look like on the LGBTQIA plus community? And then what, as our company, what is our commitment to, I know that human resource, the HRC National Business Statement on anti-LGBTQ plus state legislation. I know we have signed many HRC things. And I just want to talk about that because I know one thing we're talking about is there's a sense of resiliency that we have to kind of tolerate. And then also, while we're in our persons and in our bodies at work, we're fighting legislation that is attacking our communities and me as an ally, seeing that and witnessing that. And I want to have that conversation before we wrap up for today.
Yeah.
Just to rephrase, with all the anti-gay, anti-trans bills going on right now in our country specifically, what does that impact look like right now?
Yeah, totally. I mean, just to kind of put it in scope, right? There have been over 650 anti-LGBTQ bills put forward towards committees in the United States in 2023 alone, right? It's June, y'all. We're not even halfway through the year. that's averaging like 100 bills a month, right? Additionally, seeing countries implement really severe policy that not only criminalizes queer life, but intentionally endangers the lives of those that are queer, right? So combating the criminalization of queer life requires us to occupy space. Occupying public space means occupying professional space. Using the same methods that legislators use to chip away the rights of marginalized groups, we intend to build that security into the fabric of our daily lives. That includes creating programming that demystifies elements of our communities that have been painted as taboo and therefore unprofessional. And then, initiating policy changes that can counteract kind of those adverse policy impacts, right? So we see this in the queer community, right? Just in kind of the idea of like normalizing kind of other ways of existing through occupying public space and professional space. We see this in the queer community in open displays of gender nonconformity. Those can often be construed as unprofessional, right? And it prevents people like me from positions of leadership. It inhibits professional growth, and it even endangers their livelihood and their physical safety. We see this in communities of color as well all the time, right? In how company policies have historically dictated bodily presentation in a way that favored displays of whiteness as professional and discrediting Black and Brown communities' cultural relationship to like tonsorial presentation. We see this in the quiet dismissal of differently abled employees' requests for accommodations, such as like working remotely until maybe it benefited the majority of able-bodied and neurotypical people during a plague. The point is, right, company policy has the power to drastically affect the day-to-day lives of people, especially marginalized people, and the convenience or privilege with which we're allowed to show up as our authentic selves in the work that we do. So by adding small layers of protection, exposure, representation, and education into company policy, we're able to move towards a workplace that is actually built for all of us to succeed, and not just the few that inherited power, money, and influence before other groups had access to those resources. So that's why I think that this is some of the most important work that I've ever actually done in my career. The ripple is always bigger than the stone can see, right? And I feel that way about kind of these small policy implementations. And I'd say that just kind of to like close the loop on that, on 2U's commitment, allowing, right, the occupation of that space is amazing. Right. Being able to allow ERG leaders into rooms with leadership to have these conversations is critical. So kind of allowing for that space to exist. And then commitment also looks like celebration and policy review. It looks like flexibility, right? It looks like being able to say like, maybe this plan isn't, as great as it was 10 years ago, or maybe we need to revamp this now that we have some more information. And I think that ERGs provide a really unique opportunity to provide those like different perspectives. And there are plenty of things within creating a more universal design that are then going to make things better for everyone. Policy, training, verbiage, whatever that looks like. Yeah, so I would say that in general, yeah, kind of the occupation of public space, being allowed, being able to have that seat at the table, and then being able to be flexible, so that we can create that change is really, that is kind of the greatest sign of commitment to me.
1000%. Well, Ren, it again has been an honor to have this fireside chat with you. I cannot wait to see you next week when you're in the office. But thank you everyone for joining us today as we discuss what queer leadership looks like at our company. And thank you to Power to Fly for having us with us today. So thank you.
Thank you all.